This week, we welcome Madelein van der Hout. She's the senior analyst at Forrester to discuss enforcement of the Digital Operational Resilience Act, commonly known as DORA. In the Leadership and Communication segment, cybersecurity responsibilities across the C-suite, a breakdown for every executive. Humble leaders inspire others to step up. Effective communication in the workplace, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control on every executable that can happen in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 381, recorded February 3rd, 2025. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this interview segment today are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Happy snow day.
Happy snow day. Yeah, we had a little bit of snow here in New England, and kids had an hour delay. Good to go. Hey, it wouldn't be Super Bowl season without a little snow, right?
Right. Always some good playoff games in the snow. We had a couple this year.
Hey,
yeah.
You know what? I'm looking forward to it. I'm going Philly all the way. I'm one of those anybody but the Chiefs kind of guy, ABC. So yeah, let's go Philly.
There you go. Also joining me from the warm state of Texas, Mr. Ben Carr. We finally got some warm weather.
Yeah, not having a snow day. It was a great weekend. I think it was like in the 80s yesterday. It's down to like 76 or something. So a little chilly here in Austin right now, Jason. But thinking of you.
Jealous.
Madelein is a senior analyst on Forrester Security and Risk team, focusing on European security consulting firms, European CISO strategy work, and security operating model and organizational research. She supports security executives and professionals in building and maturing their security goals. Prior to joining Forrester, Madelein worked at KPN, a Dutch telecommunications and technology company. She worked primarily in the fields of innovation, transformation, cybersecurity, and identity and advising management. Madelein, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I must say, Jason, I'm sorry, but I'm Kansas City Chiefs all the way. Been for 5 years, so this will be a little rivalry when the Super Bowl comes around.
Very good, very good. Hey, so I'm in New England. I can't let the Kansas City Chiefs catch up on the dynasty, so that's the deal there.
I can imagine.
Yeah, you got to keep the number of Super Bowl wins down.
That's
they can
right.
go,
Exactly.
but they just can't win them all.
You got it.
I even have the little helmet over here, so
Nice.
Nice. Yeah, we were talking about American football earlier, so not a lot of Europeans get into the sport, but Madelein has for sure. Oh,
yeah. Now that I'm at it, just for the proof point.
Nice.
And well, to be fair, sports references are one of the best references and metaphors for cybersecurity. So
Agreed.
Why not embrace it? That's awesome.
Exactly.
We're not going to talk football. We're going to talk DORA and the regulatory requirement. So let's start with what is DORA? A lot of people have heard about it, but what actually is DORA?
The DORA is the Digital Operational Resilience Act. That actually is a transformative EU regulation, which is specifically designed for digital operational resilience of financial entities. And what is different about DORA is that it also takes into account the ICT service providers, so critical ICT service providers that service these financial entities. So we've seen in the past that cyber security threats, but also other digital disruptions have really grown. We have grown more and more reliant on digital paying systems and digital systems. And that really creates a need for more robust cybersecurity within those organizations. So it is really here to strengthen resilience. One of my favorite anecdotes actually is that a long time ago was 2017, if I'm not mistaken, we saw this large disruption. And one of the main articles or headlines in the news were that there was this guy, and because of the disruption, he could not prove that he paid his jail sum. So he could not go home for the weekend, while he actually had paid that. So, well, that traveled into a lawsuit, but it showed that we had way too much reliance on the digital systems while they were not secured enough. And, well, in this case, it was just a guy going to jail. But imagine that you cannot pay for your groceries, that you cannot pay your mortgage. Imagine being on the verge of being evicted or whatsoever. That can, well, cause huge troubles. That's also why they take into account now the critical ICT providers of those financial entities.
Yeah, I started, but before my product career, I was running the third-party vendor risk management program at one of the large banks here in the U.S., right? Trying to understand the risk profile of all the providers. It sounds like DORA's kind of solidified parts of that into the requirements and into this regulation. It's not only the financial institutions, it's the key partners that support those digital systems as well are also in scope.
Exactly. And it's even in the regulation, it states that if your ICT service providers do not meet the requirements, you can also terminate the contract you have with them. And usually with those those type of organizations, you have multi-year projects, multi-year contracts. So we never seen that you can actually by law terminate a contract because of those requirements. And one of the other things that I believe is very important about the Digital Operational Resilience Act is that it truly harmonizes standards for the financial industry amongst the entire European Union. So it has a unified EU-wide framework for operational resilience. So that provides consistency, but also clarity for financial institutions that are also operating across multiple member states.
So Madelein, we talk about operational resilience, right? So DORA must go well beyond simply just cyber attack. It must handle other types of disruptions as well, operational type incidents or natural disasters, supply chain disruptions, things like that, correct?
Is actually for, well, cyber threats and digital disruptions, but mostly for cyber attacks. We have other regulation as well. It's called CER, which is also for when you have a disaster like a tornado. Well, we don't have tornadoes, but like if you have a natural disaster, we have a lot of floods. For instance, if your server goes down because of a flood, that's within that regulation. Yeah, but it is also about digital disruption. That is true. The Act talks about cyber incidents.
Okay,
got it. Now, EU framework. Obviously, if you're working with EU financial systems, I assume these cross borders, right? Because you have non-EU participants, including the United States, that also may fall under the scope?
Definitely. If you're doing business in the EU, you can be drawn under the scope if you have entities within the EU. And if you're an ICT provider that provides services to financial entities within the European Union, you will be under the scope. To me, it will be very interesting because, well, DORA talks about that concentration risk. So how diverse is your IT infrastructure? What are your interdependencies with that ICT service provider, with that critical ICT service provider? Well, we all know how complex IT infrastructures can be. So it is very difficult to just replace one of your providers. But it really talks about the concentration risk and those interdependencies that you have to map. You need to make sure that those providers comply, that it's in the contracts. That is new, that is different, and I'm interested to see how they are going to enforce that, especially since we rely quite heavily on some large tech organizations from overseas.
Yeah, like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Azure, like those are two big concentration risk areas, right?
Definitely. So
it's easy.
I'm sorry, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, I was going to say that too, like on the big companies, it's easy to see where there would be issues potentially with organizations that are outside the EU, but it's much easier to enforce in an Amazon or a Microsoft because they have a presence in the EU, right? So one of my concerns is, what about the smaller organizations, right? So I see a twofold problem. One is the enforcement side, right? So there could be smaller companies, especially in cyber, we tend to have a lot of small, unique point solutions to things that there aren't a lot of competitors to potentially, right? And so you could have something that's an emergent technology that addresses a very specific cyber technical risk, but there's not a replacement for. As well as I could see, even if you're not in cyber, a small financial, like you've got to adhere to DORA, but how do you burden yourself with the compliance regulation around DORA, right? How does a small cyber company burden themselves with these compliance regulations? That's always an issue when we get into these very large, overreaching regulatory issues. Is I'm a small company, I can't burden the cost of that, right? Like, how do you see that?
Well, that is actually a real struggle. So smaller financial entities, for instance, they have less resources. Let's be honest. To comply with the DORA regulations, you need to have a cybersecurity organization within your organization. So you need to have dedicated resources that, well, are responsible for your cybersecurity. So for them, it's way more difficult to comply. They do not have the resources in terms of staffing. They do not have the resources in terms of money. It is quite costly. I've had many organizations of which I had sessions on the Digital Operational Resilience Act. One of the main things that came from those sessions is that in maintenance, those organizations will need to have an increase of their security budget for between 10 and 30%. That's large. We have stringent budgets. So there were a couple of organizations, and this is not the main trend, but there were a couple of organizations that mentioned for implementation, it was 35% to 50%. And then for maintenance, at least 10. That is a large increase. Imagine being a smaller organization, then cybersecurity, it will take away from your competitive advantage.
Right.
You won't have that at all.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to ask. Does that limit competition a bit in the region?
Because we've seen that here in the States a little bit with FedRAMP, right? Like, so there is the challenge of, in order to be in FedRAMP, you have to, use FedRAMP service providers. They have to be FedRAMP certified. So that presents its own unique challenge. And then there are smaller companies that decide, do I really want to engage in federal business right now? Because I don't have the efficiency of scale to support the operations to get FedRAMP certified, right? So it's almost a chicken and the egg. And it sounds like it's the same kind of thing. Like, there's not a carve out in DORA to say you're under a certain size, so you don't have the same amount of regulations as a Bank of Scotland, right? Like, everybody's got the same onerous controls.
Yeah, and I mean, that was going to be my question. What is the impact if you're non-compliant? What is the risk and impact for non-compliance? Is it loss of revenue due to the inability to do business with other companies? Is it fines? You have to be able to weigh non-compliance and the expenditure impact that you're going to have to put out, right? So what is the impact if you're non-compliant?
the impact is quite large. The impact is really large. If you fail to comply, you will face very, very large fines. So the fines can be up to 2 million euros. So up to 2 million or 2% of your
mirroring
annual
GDPR.
your annual worldwide turnover.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But they are also saying that certain individuals within your organization are responsible for cybersecurity. So you can also have individual penalties that can reach up to 1 million. So
Wow.
they can also look at, they also take into account your ICT risk provider. So they will look at the ICT risk provider. If they see that you're not compliant via the ICT risk provider, they can go after you as well. So it will be an entire snowball effect that they can go through. They even include like administrative measures. So license suspension, for instance, for non-compliance. Mandatory corrective actions. So if they see that you fail to comply, regulators can force you to have the correct measures, which means that is probably more expensive because you have to take care of it right away. It talks about executive liability. So the implications of not complying are very large. I must state that the financial entities within the European Union always have had strong regulation that they had to comply with. They were always, because of the nature of the data that those entities have, they are a very attractive target. So they already knew what they were dealing with. So if the Digital Operational Resilience Act is completely new to those organizations and they have to implement everything, then something was wrong by default already. So
Yeah.
that's what I really wanted to state as well.
But Madelein, there's a bit of scope creep, right? So you mentioned something that was really important, and if people haven't been doing this and you're not in the industry, you may not realize it is. You said 2% of your global revenue, right? And so one of those things is, as a large company looks at acquisitions and doesn't consider the risk and the appetite of that smaller entity they're acquiring, you could easily acquire somebody and then put the entire revenue of the global company at risk because of that acquisition that you didn't plan for appropriately.
Spot on. That's why cybersecurity should be such an important part of due diligence.
It's got to be built into everything, right? Like that should be one of the first things you're considering, from acquisition to new product to, just strategy, right? It's got to be fundamental to what you're doing.
So,
Exactly.
so to steal one of Matt's comments, I want to double click on something. you had mentioned, as you were explaining, you had mentioned there's a level of liability and accountability on executives. We talk about this a lot on this show, especially with the CISO role. So executive can be a broad term. When executives are held liable, at what level are we speaking? Are we speaking board of directors? Are we speaking CEO, CFO? Are we speaking the entire C-suite? Or is it a scapegoat of a CISO?
Stole my thunder on that one, Jason. I was going to ask that. Where's the scapegoat?
Members. Board members. So the entire C-suite, actually. It's board members. So they look at the governance structure, and board members, they are required to actually oversee, and they're required to implement and oversee the ICT risk management framework. So they are the ones that are signing off. So I think this is just as NIS2. So NIS2 is another large European legislation. This is a directive. I'm not going to confuse everyone or bore everyone with it. But in there, we also are talking about boardroom accountability and liability. DORA has that as well, and we take it up to the board level. So usually what we see is that you have that sacrificial lamb, which is usually the CISO or someone underneath it. You know, we should not do that because we want to go away from the security blaming and shaming. Then we should not have a sacrificial lamb. I think that's so important. One of the things that struck me last year was that I read this research where I saw that still 30% of CISOs will be, was it 30? No, even more, higher, of CISOs would be no, it was 30%, would be fired after an incident worldwide. That's a third. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's not working on a solution. That's just finding the sacrificial lamb.
Well,
And that's what we,
a lot of it is because we don't have some of that accountability at the board level. And I'm curious how that's transpired in the EU, because are you seeing an evolution in the way executives are compensated, protected, et cetera? Because now you have these broader regulatory things kind of sitting over top of them that could create more liability for them, whether it's personally or as part of the business. Is that changing the way board makeups and executive makeup structures are happening?
Well, I must say that it was within the EU quite long overdue. So when looking at organizational structures, I think if we look at regional differences, the EU was lagging behind. So the EU needs to catch up when it comes to CISOs reporting into the board. I think in North America, more CISOs were already reporting into the board. So you have a different way of influence. So I strongly believe that within the EU, we need to make up some time with that, or we need to rapidly go through that development. So this was long overdue, in my opinion. CISO should report into the board, period. It should be, and we already managed security up like for years. So it's not like that CISOs are not having conversation with boards. I just strongly believe that you need that reporting line because you can have more influence. What I do believe is that there is movement in payment, movement in that within Europe, we are less sacrificing our CISOs when a breach occurs. And now with the legislation, we have to take accountability and liability on cybersecurity as the entire C-suite because of the legislation. What I do like about that is that they have to be involved in decision making, in ICT risk frameworks, in providing a periodical reviewing, but also in knowledge and training. So the training that you usually have your employees go through, they will need to have active training and not like I'm doing my email and I'm clicking on a video and those type of training. No, we really have to work through it. We really have to understand what the threats are per employee group and those sort of things. So I think that is really, really important, and that we do see that evolution, but that evolution is speeding up, and it should speed up with Europe.
You said something earlier that the financials have been highly regulated in Europe, as they have in the States. So for the financial institutions, DORA is probably not a big leap for them because they have teams in place and they've been under scrutiny. My guess is the biggest impact is to the third-party provider supporting the financials that may or may not have prepared for any of this in advance.
It's been hard on a lot of financial entities still because they had to map everything they had on the legislation and see where the requirements and measures that the regulation demands them to have, and especially within that diversity of their ICT infrastructure. That has been hard. One of the hard things as well, I even have it here, this show. I'm sorry already for murdering the tree, but this is all the regulation and the addendums on DORA. And it also talks about your backups. It talks about that you need to have a recovery time of 2 hours. Recovery time of 2 hours. How are you going? That is on your backups. But it really talks about business continuity. That mapping and understanding what you have in place and what you still need to take care of. That has, well, a lot of organizations were very worried that they were not making the deadline. And one of the hardest conversations that they had to have was actually with those ICT service providers. There were ICT service providers that just said to the organizations, yeah, I'm not going to put that in my contract. And then they had to make the decision, okay, you're not putting it in our contract. So what now? Am I going to terminate the contract? Or I don't want to do that because the impact on my ICT infrastructure is large. We have to replace everything,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. So that has been really stressful for a lot of organizations. And yes, there are also a lot of willing ICT service providers that are really looking into how can we make this work. They are working from a more trusted advisor point of view. How can we help you? And I think that is where we should go to as an industry. Criminals are going crazy fast. We should work together, help each other, share information. That's the only way forward. So if we're working against each other because of legislation, we are doing something very wrong, in my opinion.
So Madelein, you just held up something that was about the size of one book of an encyclopedia. And with organizations having to adhere to multiple regulations, how are they demonstrating to regulators that they're actually prepared and adhering to DORA? Is it third-party audits that they have to get periodically? What is the cadence? What's the overhead on these organizations, not just to get up to speed to the controls, but what's the overhead for them to actually show compliance?
Well, they have to document everything. So, for instance, that ICT risk framework, all the measures they have in place, they need to be able to prove that they have a proper incident response plan in place. They have to report into an authority register. It needs to be, regular testing. Let me think. I think every 3 years, and annual assessments. So they need to have penetration testing every 3 years, and they need to have annual assessments of their critical systems. So that's a lot of overhead. So you need to keep up to date your systems. You need to have all the measures up to date. If something is different in your instant response process, you need to add that. You need to keep a list of everyone you work with. You need to have very strong collaboration with your legal department, with other departments. So governance is you need to have great governance within your organization as well. So that is a lot of overhead.
Who actually certifies the quality of the results of the quote unquote assessment or testing or submission? Is it I do a self-assessment questionnaire and submit it to the regulators, or is it a third party who actually comes in and gathers artifacts to prove that you're doing the things you say you're doing?
Both. So
Okay.
you conduct self-assessments, but also a third party, and they are they should be authorized by authorities in the EU. So as an organization that conducts those, there should be organizations that are approved.
Okay.
Got it. Yeah. So kind of like a little bit of like what we do here, right? Some self-assessment, some like PCI, right?
The concern is always a check in the box regulation. We know what the end result of a check in the box regulation does. Absolutely nothing, right? So to be able to have a level of assessment where you're proving out the fact that you're building this resilience posture and then compliance as a byproduct of that, kind of like what we talk about all the time, right? Compliance should be a byproduct of a strong program.
They have, because I think that's important to note as well. So you do both your self-assessment, and you have, because the regulation emphasizes on both. You need to have that ICT risk management framework. You need to be able to show that, prove that, those sort of things. You need to do scenario testing for digital operational resilience. So they call it digital operational resilience testing, but it is scenario testing, basically. And there are compliance tools. So there is this DORA compliance self-assessment tool. I think it is developed by Ecovis, Preventers Law, something like that. I have seen it. It has approximately 200 questions. So, that's quite a lot. That is time extensive. Then you also have your third-party risk management, or third-party organizations that can test. They also look at the continuous monitoring and the contractual agreements, if you have done that right. So it is both, but it is a lot of work, and you need to be able to show it. And I think that's where a lot of organizations, they don't want to invest their time in that. They want to invest their time in having a great posture, do continuous improvement in that posture, and not be bothered by reactive self-testing or reactive testing. And to be fair, I do understand that.
Yeah. That's why continuous monitoring or some sort of automation kind of gives you some relief over doing it manually and manual all the time.
Yeah, and entities are really expected to maintain a detailed register of all ICT third-party services, and that they document the services that they provide, but also the associated risk and the risk tolerance that they have, or that they estimated. So that is extensive.
Yeah, very extensive. Madelein, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.